My name is Grace Shu-Gerloff, and I am a PhD student in sociocultural anthropology at Michigan State University. Today, I'll be talking about the anthropology of transnational adoption as it relates to migration. So transnational adoption is broadly defined as the adoption of a child to a country that is different than the one that they were born in. Oftentimes it's adoption to the United States or other Western countries. Scandinavia, places like Sweden, Norway, and Finland are also big places where adoptees end up. So transnational adoption is something that we see a lot, but maybe don't notice. So it's shown in popular media. Shows like Modern Family and Sex and the City have both featured transnational adoption in their storylines. We also see celebrities who have adopted transnationally. Famously, the Jolie Pitt family adopted children from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. And they also have biological children as well. And then finally, we have social media influencers, YouTubers and vloggers who have adopted, and that's often featured in the content of their videos as well. Some key considerations to think about when we're talking about transnational adoption, or if you ever find yourself talking to an adoptee or people involved in adoption studies, is first, terms like birth or biological or first parent are generally preferred over calling an adoptee's birth parent their real parent. And this is mostly to acknowledge the fact that adoptive parents still parent their child and are a part of raising them. And so understanding that parenting or family is more than just biological or blood ties. The second important thing to consider is that a critical approach to adoption studies does not necessarily mean someone hates their adoptive parents or is against a transnational adoption or their own adoption. It usually just means that we need to think about adoption holistically, think about it as something that's not just good or just bad, but understand the history behind it. And so we're going to talk more about that history later on. It's also important to note that adoption varies across sending and receiving countries. Sending countries are the ones that the adoptee is born into. And then the receiving countries are the ones that they are adopted into. So if a child is born in China and adopted from China and then raised in the United States, China would be their sending country, the United States being their receiving country. And so geopolitical relations are different between every country. And so that's going to affect how transnational adoption works. The ethics and laws around adoption differ between country to country. And then also, of course, individual experiences of adoptees, adoptive parents, why the adoptive parents wanted to adopt, why birth parents gave their children up for adoption or were unable to care for them. And then also finally, and maybe most important, is that adoption is traumatic and complicated. Even if an adoptee has had a very good upbringing and feels very happy and settled with their life, the act of forcibly removing a child from their home and putting them into a completely new setting is going to be fairly traumatic no matter how you swing it. Not all adoptees are going to see their adoption as a traumatic event. And so it's also important to note that every adoptee is going to have different feelings about their adoption. Some want to talk about it, some don't. And so when thinking about adoption, it's important to also consider that everyone has different feelings. It's varied. And so it's important that we, of course, remain respectful of that. So now some background on adoption. Transnational adoption started mainly after World War II, and adoption from Korea is what really set the precedent for how we understand transnational adoption today and how the laws around transnational adoption have evolved. So it started with the Korean War, which went from 1950 until the ceasefire was called in 1953. This involved the adoption of primarily war orphans, so children who had been orphaned by the war and that their parents had been killed, or children whose parents were separated from them because of the war as well. And then also the adoption of GI babies, who were the children or the product of relations between American GIs or soldiers and Korean women. So these children were either given up or taken for adoption. For the GI babies, it was often that many of them were born out of wedlock, and once the soldier or the biological father of this child returned back to the United States, the mother who was left unwed did not have the resources to care for this child and was given up. And so there was an organization called Holt International that was primarily responsible for the first wave of Korean adoptees. This was a man named Harry and his wife Bertha Holt, who adopted from Korea and then began this very large industry of a transnational adoption. And Holt International still exists today, and it's a very large adoption agency between the US and Asia, and as well as some other countries. So the media represented adoptees as always in need of rescue or charity, and this primarily comes from the adoption of children during the or in the aftermath of the Korean War. However, it's important to note that most Korean adoptees were actually adopted later, long after the war had ended. So most of these adoptees were not war orphans and were not actually GI babies. They were children who were relinquished or given up for adoption because their families felt like they could not take care of them, or they were born to, again, unwed mothers. And being a single mother at that time, just like in the United States, was heavily stigmatized. There also weren't very many options for family planning. And so a lot of women were giving birth who did not have the resources to care for a child, and thus they were adopted out. And so because of these conditions, the media represented adoptees as in need of rescue and charity, and adoption as this very good, oftentimes Christian act of salvation. They also depicted Korea as perpetually war-torn, backwards, and impoverished even long after the war had ended and Korea was beginning to build itself up again. They compared this to the United States, which they framed as very paternalistic and democratic and therefore culturally superior to Korea. So showing the US as inherently better than Korea in terms of development, in terms of policies and culture, was used to then justify the export of children to the United States instead, and show adoption as this act of salvation from Korea, which was again seen as very war-torn and backwards. Now, because most adoptees are adopted quite young, usually under the age of 5, they were seen as very exceptional in terms of being able to adapt or assimilate to American culture. Most of these adoptees were also adopted into predominantly white households in the United States. And so not only were they able to assimilate to American culture, but also white culture, which was the dominant culture. They're also seen as being very well adjusted, mainly because they're such a young age. They don't have a bunch of conscious memories of Korea or their life before, or of the trauma of adoption. So they're seen as adoptees that aren't going to become problems later on. And then, of course, because of the depictions of Korea and the United States, adoptees are often framed as these recipients for charitable actions. So their parents, their adoptive parents, saw that they were in need and then rescued them, right, from Korea. And therefore, adoptees are often encouraged to express the sense of gratitude towards their adoptive parents for, saving them from what was supposedly going to be a very harsh upbringing. This is, of course, always done without much knowledge of what that child's upbringing would have actually been like. And so it's sort of superimposed on the adoptee. As adoptees have gotten older, especially the adult Korean adoptee communities, they've begun to organize and advocate against some of these ideas about Korean adoption as solely being a good thing, solely being beneficial for the adoptee, and that adoptees should feel this inherent sense of gratitude to their adoptive parents. Adult adoptees advocate for more adoptee representation and adoptee voices and agency in discussing issues of transnational adoption. That's because most of these media representations of adoptee were constructed by adoptive parents who wanted to feel like they had done the right thing and had done the good thing for their child. And then also these representations were created by adoption agencies who, of course, stood to benefit financially from increasing the flow of adoption from Korea to the United States and other countries. Adult Korean adoptees also push for a more critical approach to understanding transnational adoption, especially when that adoption crosses racial lines, and to understand adoption as a traumatic experience, not something that, once the adoptee arrives in their adoptive country, in their adoptive household, then it's happily ever after for them, but that the adoptee then grows up and has confusion over why they were given up, why they were adopted, and also why they might not look like their adoptive parents when most of their friends oftentimes look like their their parents. And so they push for more critical understandings of the history behind adoption, and also critical understandings of how adoptees develop a sense of identity, instead of just glossing over and pretending like everything is fine when it's not. Finally, Korean adoptees organize through global networks, and a lot of them have used their organizing and activism to advocate for more citizenship rights for Korean adoptees. US immigration law, which we'll talk about later, was changing a lot following the Korean War and following World War II. And so there have been a lot of complicated loopholes in which Korean adoptees find that they have unstable or unreliable citizenship documentation. So adoption from China is another case of transnational adoption that also was developed from Korean adoption, but was another significant part in setting the precedent for how adoption, transnational adoption is done today. So unlike Korea, adoption from China was not the result of any kind of war or US military intervention, but was actually the result of policies in China, specifically one that is known as the one-child policy, which was the type of population control that was implemented to limit the amount of children per family, so that the government could better care for its citizens. So the policy dictated that there could be one birth per family, and then that was later amended to allow for 2 for rural families who might have needed more help around the house, or also doing farm work if they were on a farm. This policy was heavily critiqued by the international community as being totalitarian, and oftentimes China was painted as being very culturally backwards for allowing such a policy to take effect, and having that result in there being a high number of children who were considered adoptable within Chinese orphanages. This view of China as inherently negative, totalitarian, was then used to justify the export of children to the United States rather than allowing them to stay in China to be adopted by Chinese families. So the representation of Chinese adoptees is not dissimilar from Korean adoptees. A lot of that rhetoric was drawn from what people understood about Korean adoptees. So again, the idea that adoptees were these exceptional exceptions, that they were easily assimilable, and that they would just be overall psychologically well-adjusted. The surge in Chinese adoption started in the 1990s and went through the 2000s. So a lot of those adoptees are around college age right now. While, again, it was very similar to Korean adoption, what was a bit different about Chinese adoption was that the adoptive parents at this time understood race and identity to be something that's related to multiculturalism. So they understood that they had to expose their children, their adopted children, to what they deemed to be the child's birth culture, their understandings of Chinese culture. However, at the time, there weren't a ton of resources out there for adoptive parents to talk about race. So when they, instead of talking about race, they focused in on culture and exposed their children to what they understood to be Chinese culture. And again, many of these adoptive parents were not Chinese and had had little exposure to Asia, Chinese communities, or anything prior to adoption. So for a lot of adoptees, exposure to birth culture meant eating Chinese food and watching movies. During this time, a big one for a lot of adoptees was the Disney animated Mulan, because that came out in the 90s as well. On top of this, there was this idea for both Chinese and Korean adoptees that their racialization as Asian American was very flexible. This meant that Asians were and still are seen as closer to white people, and therefore, again, are people that could be easily assimilated and enveloped into white culture in ways that other races were not. So this idea that, by incorporating birth culture, a parent could avoid having to grapple with race and talk about race was very prevalent for Chinese adoptees as well as Korean adoptees. Another thing to note is that adoptees were often treated or talked about in very commodifying ways. They were talked about like these little collectibles or cultural exports. So oftentimes when an adoptive parent would make the trip to China to adopt their child, they were treated as almost souvenirs that were brought back from this journey, as instead of being people and children and full human beings. So like I said, Chinese adoptees are starting to come of age now, and they heavily utilize social media to organize, to speak out about their adoption, about their experiences, raise awareness, and also to connect with each other and find other adoptee communities. This has become especially important during the COVID-19 pandemic, where people have been more physically distanced and so are being able to turn to social media to form relationships. Main ones that are used are generally Facebook groups that are just for adoptees. Instagram has been used a lot to put out informational content, and then also TikTok has been used a lot among the younger generations of adoptees. These adoptees tend to post things and discuss more concerns with their own racial identity formation, questions about what it means to be Asian or Asian American when one is raised in a white household, and also placing that within the context of movements for racial justice as well. Questions about what it means to be a non-Black person of color that was raised by white people. How can, as transracial adoptees, how can they help the fight for racial justice? So a lot of concerns about trying to place their identity within the broader context of how we understand race today in the United States. And again, as I said, Chinese adoptees have been heavily inspired by the adult Korean adoptee community, who have organized for a long time now. And I think that has given Chinese adoptees and just younger adoptees in general this pathway and this framework to understand how to navigate and bring a more critical approach to their own adoption.